Thank you. Albert Koehl. Oh, he is. Hi there, Albert. You'll have 5 minutes. I'm going to reset the clock to my right.
Hey, thanks very much. My name's Albert Koehl. A few years ago, I served on the expert panel for Ontario's chief coroner on his review of pedestrian deaths, and one of his key recommendations was in fact lowering speed limits to reduce the number of people being killed. Today I'm here as vice chair of the Annex Residents Association. It's been our policy since 2011 to get lower speed limits, 30-kilometer speed limits on area roads. We held a public consultation where there was overwhelming support for lower speed limits. The recent push for lower speed limits has gained traction in many parts of the world for an obvious reason. Is that when we think of our own parents or our spouse or our children, we want the car that is going beside them or near them to be going slower rather than more quickly. More and more people are rejecting the traditional notion that death is an acceptable cost of our transport system. This rejection entails lower speed limits. So attempts to lower speed limits actually date to the 1920s when cars first became common. And one of the reasons for that is that people were outraged by the number of children that were being killed by cars. And there was a movement, in fact, to get speed governors on cars to slow them down. But of course the auto lobby was very strong, and today even in Toronto Star I was reading about an article about a car that was described, a new car described as deceptively quick, 340 horsepower, 330 pound per foot torque, and 0 to 100 in 6.4 seconds. So the obvious question is, what parent wants to share, have their kids share that road with that car? That's a question we haven't asked for a long time. And now we're starting to ask that question, and that's why we're getting resistance. So what's changed today? Well, for starters, we have the evidence of clear science of the benefits of lower speeds, and we also have 300,000 deaths since 1920 on our roads involving motor vehicles. So I think we're also a bit more savvy about rejecting some of the excuses that we often hear touted, excuses that aren't supported by science. So the science today makes us a bit more confident about talking about 30-kilometer speed limits. I mean, that, the figures that we've heard about the lower chances of being killed are pretty dramatic. I think we're also less cowed by this slogan of war on the car that we often hear when we try to propose anything that will make our roads safer. When my toaster breaks, I don't wave my fist at the toaster and declare war on the toaster. I try to get my toaster fixed, and that's in fact what we're trying to do today. One of the things that tells us that our transport system isn't working very well is in fact the number of deaths that we have on our roads, along with things like climate change, air pollution, noise, cost, and so on. I think it's really important, this motion that you're discussing to lower speed limits, for a couple of obvious reasons that if some of them have been mentioned today. I think it sends a clear message to other parts of the city as well. Parts of the city like Finch, for example, and the number of deaths on Finch is simply outrageous, and I hope the councillors for Finch are listening to this as well. I grew up in Windsor, Ontario, on an arterial road. Despite the fact that it was arterial, I still had to cross the street to go to school. I still had to deliver my papers. I still had to visit friends. I still had to go shopping. And so the fact that we call these roads arterial, especially Finch, take a look at Finch. I mean, there are all kinds of people that live along Finch. For those people, it's not an arterial road, it's a residential road where their kids walk. And unfortunately, those roads are very dangerous. A neighbor of mine in Windsor, along that very road, he was killed. He was a grade younger than me at grade school, was killed when he was delivering the newspapers. So the second thing why it's very important to take this action today is it also opens the door for smaller, lower powered cars. Remember 10 years ago we started talking about Zen cars and lower powered vehicles, zero emission vehicles. I think instead of talking about this 340 horsepower vehicle, we can talk about lower powered cars that will be more suitable for urban environments. And finally, I reject the idea of doing these speed reductions in conjunction with traffic calming. That will take many decades, will slow things down, and the question is how many people will die unnecessarily, avoidably during that time. So finally, I'd say lowering speed limits is all about increasing the margin of error so that a small mistake, a senior losing their balance on the sidewalk or a child distracted by a bird, doesn't become fatal. Errors in judgment should not be punished with a death sentence. So lower speed limits increase the margin of error, and ultimately we live or die in that margin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koehl. You've got a couple questions. Councillor Cressy, then Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Albert. Just a couple very brief questions. So you said you're here today on behalf of the Annex Residents Association.
Yes.
And you hosted a public consultation on this?
Yes.
And what was the feedback at that consultation from residents?
Well, we asked people at that meeting. There were about 70 people. We publicized that widely, and there was one of several safety features that we discussed, one of them being 30-kilometer speed limits. And I can tell you there was overwhelming support for 30-kilometer speed limits in our neighborhood, that being the Annex.
And the Annex Residents Association has endorsed this, I take it?
We're in support.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes, earlier just when you started, thank you for coming, you'd mentioned that you had worked for the coroner. Could you just tell me that again? I missed that part.
You know, in 2011, a colleague of mine and I, Patrick Brown, we went to the coroner on behalf of United Senior Citizens and a number of other community groups, and asked the coroner specifically to do a review of pedestrian and cycling deaths. The last review of cycling deaths had been in 1998, and there was a flurry of deaths in the preceding year to our request. So we represented those groups, and then were asked to sit on on the coroner's expert committee.
And which then determined, I think you'd mentioned, the coroner's expert committee determined that 30 for a residential street is a good, is the speed that we should be working.
Well, the top recommendation, yes, was for complete streets. So a suite of recommendations, but one of them was certainly lower speed limits and lower default speed limits, including 30 kilometers in residential areas.
Well, that would basically be the default on a residential should be 30, and that's
Yes.
what the annex supports. Of course, you know that the default, unless posted somewhere, is 50 in the city of Toronto. And so that report from the coroner, where is that available? Because I don't see it mentioned anywhere in this report.
I can, number one, send it to you, but I can also tell you it's simply on the coroner's site. If you Google coroner's pedestrian death review or coroner's cycling death review, you'll find it there.
And that's the coroner for the Ontario province?
Ontario's chief coroner, correct.
All right. I appreciate it when you say is the small mistake, but even if we can stop a small mistake, that would be very good. I'm just wondering about other traffic calming measures. If you think there should be other traffic calming measures that the city would be proactive about, if your residents association has thought about that in any way, outside of reduction of speed limits.
Yeah. Well, my concern about traffic calming is that it's generally associated with a significant cost. I mean, the reason I think the lower speed limit, it doesn't have to be police enforced. I think giving the community the moral authority to enforce that. I know in our neighborhoods, people are very vigilant on their streets. I'm one of the people that will wave my arms at someone who's going, even say 50 in an area where there are children. But I think the moral authority you get by being able to say this is 30 and waving your hand or your fist or whatever the case might be at that driver, I think that has a real power. And I think the other thing, obvious things, for example, that we need to be looking at are a cycling network. That's an obvious one. Ontario roads, more mid-block crossings, which was one of the coroner's recommendations. So I think those things are really important. But the speed limit reduction sends a clear message, is a part of a cultural shift, and is very, very important.
Yes, and you note in this report that it apparently is extremely expensive. Do you think $225 a sign, it seems a bit high?
I can't comment on that. If it saves a life, that's well spent.
No, I meant the cost of that, but the $1 million that we would spend for all of this old city of Toronto and East York to change all of the signs, you think that would be money well spent then?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had Councillor Davis and then Councillor Mahavik.
Did the coroner's report have any comments about police enforcement?
There were various elements of that and I can't remember specifically in terms of police report enforcement. There were definitely recommendations around better driver training, also better cyclist and pedestrian education, but specifically around police enforcement, I don't recall what the recommendation was.
Okay, I'll ask staff if we have any information either about police enforcement.
Councillor Mahevik?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Previous deputy mentioned, and I'm guessing that you probably agree, that lowering the speed in and of itself without doing other things has an effect, but perhaps not as big an effect as we would like. Did the coroner, from your knowledge, what other things need to happen to actually get that speed lowered?
Well, I don't know if the coroner went into additional details around that. I mean, they definitely talked about provincial action and municipal action, but in terms of other things to get drivers to respect the speed limit, I don't recall if there are any other
Anything around narrowing of the roads or at intersections, stuff like that?
I'd have to take a look back at that, but I know there were certainly recommendations around road design, and the whole idea of a complete streets is to make a street safely shared by the various different road users. And specific has been mentioned that the coroner talked about a paradigm shift that we've heard here as well this afternoon.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? No?